How to use the worst planet in your chart for good. So in today's video, I'm giving you 5 ways to work with Saturn in your chart. The first way, number 1, is to learn the psychological meaning of Saturn by sign. So whatever sign your Saturn is in is going to represent an area that you will tend to hold yourself back. There are times when this block that we have from Saturn is something external that we don't have control over. But oftentimes, regardless of what happens externally, the sign, even if you think of just the element of the sign where you have Saturn, that can give you a clue where you might block yourself. So if you have Saturn in fire, you may block yourself from new experiences or passion. If you have Saturn in air, you may block yourself in communication. If you have Saturn in earth, you may block yourself from accomplishment. And if you have Saturn in water, you may block yourself from feeling. The tricky thing here is that there are times where Saturn can make you very good at the thing, or you can even overcompensate for that block. And if you want more on what your Saturn means by sign, I do have a video on Saturn in the signs for every sign of the zodiac, so you can check those out. But when you know what sign you have Saturn in, then you can be aware of what area of life or what energies or what certain themes, life themes that you might be more likely to stop yourself or hold yourself back from doing. Saturn also does represent fear, so sometimes we're afraid of the thing that our Saturn represents. The more you are doing the things of your Saturn sign, the more you are on track to basically unblock that Saturn. Step 2 is to look at what Saturn means in your astrology chart by house. When we're looking at Saturn by house, we're looking at what area of life Saturn shows up in. So the house is definitely going to tell us things that are more external and give us more clarity on where we find our Saturn, where we might be most limited, where we are a late bloomer. This area of life, of the house of your Saturn, you may find that you don't develop into until after your first Saturn return when you're 28, or even after your the first Saturn square after the Saturn return, which is going to be closer to 36. Basically, where you have Saturn by house will give you more clues to not only what area you may have been held back by, what area you naturally have challenges in, where you feel stuck, where you have a tendency to feel stuck, things that you might not be as optimistic about, areas of life that you can't cut corners. That's all going to be represented by Saturn by house. And it can also tell you things you can develop to master. So it can be reassuring to know that wherever your Saturn is by house, that's an area of life that probably, one, is going to take more discipline and hard work on your part. You might be asked to step up to things and really be more mature. You might be the mature one in that house of life. So let's say you have Saturn in your 3rd house. Maybe you're the mature one out of your siblings, right? Because siblings go in the 3rd house. That's not the only thing. If you have Saturn in your 6th house, maybe you're the mature one at work, or you tend to get a lot of responsibility at work. So wherever Saturn is by house, that's the area you're going to get the most responsibility and discipline. To work with your Saturn by house usually involves stepping up to some kind of responsibility in that area of life. Although this will be different for everyone, that's the general way to work with Saturn, is to not cut corners, to do it right the first time, to have solid plans, and to make sure the foundation that you're relying upon is sound, solid, and trustworthy. Number 3 is to understand what part of the Saturn cycle you are in. Now, I'm talking about Saturn in the sky to your natal Saturn. There's different kinds of cycles, okay? There's like the solar cycle with Saturn. So every year the sun and the Saturn do a dance in the transiting sky. But I'm talking about, in this case, Saturn in the sky to your Saturn in your chart. So oftentimes we hear about the Saturn return. The Saturn return is when we're usually about 28, because Saturn in the sky comes back to the place it was when we were born. The cycle of Saturn in the sky to your natal Saturn That's actually a whole cycle. It's not just Saturn and then Saturn return. It's you're born, and then when you're about 7, you have your first Saturn square. When you're about 14, that's the first Saturn opposition. When you're about 21, that's the second Saturn square. And then when you're about 28, then it comes back. It's the culmination of whatever started at your last Saturn return. If you're under 28, this is when you were born. But if you're over 28, a culmination of what you started during your Saturn return. This is why you need to know the Saturn cycle. Because if you don't know the Saturn cycle, you won't know that first Saturn return, well, it's often talked about it as a difficult and challenging time. It's only difficult if we haven't reached our goals. So it's kind of like that phrase, karma's only a bitch if you are. Your Saturn return only sucks if you haven't done what you wanted to do and you have regrets. Or bad things happen in life and you have things you have to reconcile. But knowing where you are in this Saturn cycle can help you understand if you're right where you're supposed to be for the time that you're in. It can help you understand when you're in a time where the challenges that are happening are on schedule and the way to work through them is to overcome them. And it can also help you see when you might be likely to have culmination of the work that you put in. So this is why you need to understand your Saturn cycle. Step 4 is to understand what house Saturn is in for you right now. So as of the time of making this video, Saturn is in Pisces. It has just entered Pisces. So for someone with a Pisces rising, Saturn is transiting their first house. For someone with a, let's say Aquarius rising, Saturn is transiting their second house. For someone with a Virgo rising, Saturn is transiting their 7th house. So whatever house Saturn is transiting in your chart is going to have very, very strong themes for what area of life at this time you will be asked to be more responsible or have to step up to more responsibility in. So for those Virgo risings, that 7th house, your relationships may ask more from you. That can be positive in terms of commitments, or it can be challenging in terms of demands that you have to step up to. The way to work with Saturn transiting each house is to step up to the responsibility. Now, there are times, for example, with that 7th house transit where people realize this relationship isn't really worth all the work that I'm putting in. So there are times where that will happen. Wherever Saturn transits, we tend to take a good hard look at that area of life during that 2.5-year period and be asking ourselves the question, do I really want to deal with this long term? Because Saturn rules time and it rules long-term goals. For more on that, you can watch my Saturn in Pisces video. In the second half of that video, I go through what it means that Saturn is in Pisces for all 12 signs of the zodiac. And the 5th way to work with Saturn in your natal chart is to understand what aspects you have to Saturn. So when I'm talking about aspects, we're talking about a conjunction, a trine, a sextile, a square, an opposition. The aspect is just the relationship between planets. So if you're new to aspects, not every planet has a relationship in your chart with every other planet. So that while there might be some people who don't have Saturn aspects, most people are going to have probably an aspect or at least a sign-based aspect to another planet from Saturn. All aspects are important to all planets, and there are some planets in the chart that I would say are more important than Saturn. But when you're wanting to work with Saturn and get the most out of your Saturn in your chart, understanding what aspects you have to Saturn are very important. And I'm just going to give one example of why. And I'm going to give this example from my own chart. In my chart, I have Mercury conjunct Saturn. This is a very important aspect in my chart because I'm a Virgo rising and I have Gemini on the midheaven. So that means Saturn is conjunct the planet that is in charge of me, my ascendant, and it's also in charge of my career. So immediately, based on that aspect, we can assume that my career will be slower and filled with more hardships in early life, more challenging in early life. And it might possibly open up or get easier over time as I grow, mature, get older, and or learn the lesson of Saturn, which is to work hard and be disciplined, but to learn my own personal lesson, whatever that happens to be. So for you, your Saturn aspect, if Saturn, let's say hypothetically, makes an aspect to a planet that rules, let's say relationships. Well, sometimes someone with Saturn in aspect to their relationship planets, they might either be a late bloomer in relationships. They might get into relationships with people who are like Saturn. So they might be very disciplined, not very lovey-dovey, not very quick to be vulnerable, strong boundaries, even people in the military, people with that kind of personality. Or sometimes it will actually be that the partner you have is much older than you. There are other ways this can show up. This is just one example of why you need to know your Saturn aspects, because immediately it can tell you which area of life might go slower in the beginning and open up over time, and which area of life or themes in life are going to tell you, like you need to work hard in order to get this thing going or to get it working. Saturn aspects have a lot more to offer us than just that. They can also tell us a lot about our skills because Saturn does rule discipline and hard work. Not every Saturn aspect is going to be some magical skill. Sometimes it's things that are just harder for us. But oftentimes, wherever we have Saturn in our chart, we can use discipline in that area of life to get the most out of it. And there's more to this, right? So Saturn Mercury is going to give you usually a thorough mind. Saturn Venus could possibly, in a positive manifestation, could be like sculpting or doing other things that involve putting beauty to form. Using form and beauty like architecture, those kind of things. Of course, this is going to depend a lot on other things in your chart, but these are just two examples of how we can take a Saturn aspect and find some kind of skill or skill potential in that aspect. Sometimes the thing Saturn gives you is the ability to withstand, right? People with Saturn Mars, they're going to tend to have more endurance. That's the positive side. The challenging side is oftentimes people with Saturn Mars aspects have more things that they have to endure. So therefore, it's kind of a catch-22. By dealing with the hardship when you're younger, it just becomes the way it is for you and you can handle that energy, if that makes sense. Saturn aspects will also show us our challenges. And I'm only going Mercury, Venus, and Mars just for examples in this video, but Saturn with Mercury in aspect to Mercury can give challenges to being heard. They can make the person shy. They can make the person reserved or hold back from talking or be afraid of saying the wrong thing. Saturn rules fear. Saturn-Venus aspects can make the person afraid of expressing their feminine energy or their beauty. This is usually going to be harder for a woman, for example, just because, if a man isn't feminine, that's probably not going to be, usually going to be a huge challenge in his life. But oftentimes, like women with Saturn Venus will not usually enjoy making themselves pretty, or they get some conditioning when they're younger that like, you can't be beautiful. It's not okay. Afraid to express their beauty. They'll have hangups and issues around that. Or sometimes they just won't like wear a dress and that's fine too. But for the person who doesn't like that, that could be a challenge. Saturn Mars, I talked about the challenge here, which is, I would say, some of it could be repressed anger, not knowing where to put that anger. Saturn does tend to like restrict or like, stop an energy from being easily expressed. Saturn Mars, again, is also endurance. So when that aspect is triggered in transit, usually something difficult happens. We're going to stop there for the aspects, just so this video doesn't get too long, but that is what aspects can tell you. There's so much that Saturn aspects can tell you about your challenges and potential solutions, and areas where you're going to feel stuck and you're going to need to, find a practical, realistic real world solution to solve. So those are a few of the things we can learn from Saturn. Saturn has a wealth of knowledge and information for us in terms of what it can help us do. On a personal level, you guys, I was just, for some reason, looking in one of my books at one of my Saturn placement, which is Saturn in the 4th. And one of the things it said there was, you need to develop your intuition. And for those who maybe are new to my channel, and don't know, that is what I was doing in my Saturn return. I just didn't know I was honoring my Saturn. We really are guided by the universe to solve the problems in our chart. And that's one of the beautiful things about astrology, is that it can really validate that you are on the right track. This is another extra benefit to Saturn that I didn't mention, is that to learning about your Saturn placement, is that it can actually help you see that even though maybe there have been times in life that you felt lost or you haven't known if you're on the right track, sometimes just getting that validation can be that extra little assuring piece of information that helps you remember that you are right where you're supposed to be. So if you want more on Saturn, I'm actually running a course called Master Your Saturn. It's 6 weeks live with me going over how to tell everything I talked about in this video for yourself in your own chart. So you won't need to watch an energy report to see what Saturn's going to do for you, because I'm going to teach you how to see that for yourself using free software. And we're going to start from how to find Saturn in a circle chart. And we're going to go for 6 weeks, and I'm going to teach you everything I know about Saturn. So we'll go over every single topic in this video and more. So come join me as we learn about Saturn. Even though Saturn is a total buzz killer most of the time, we're going to look at the bright side. We'll also talk about the challenges, but the focus will be on how to solve the challenges and what the good things are about your Saturn, because I don't hear this talked about enough. Yes, you can put discipline and hard work into your Saturn, but there may be skills or gifts Saturn also provides you. So we're going to look at all the good stuff in addition to the challenges to help you work with this planet in your chart. So if you want to join me, click the link below. I hope to see you in there, and I will see you all in the next video.